Welcome to the More Than English podcast, where we discuss fascinating and influential ideas, learning English along the way. Here we learn more than English.
I'm your host, Stephen. Today we're going to continue with this series that we've started. In fact, today is the third episode of the series and the podcast. This first series of the podcast is What is Your Worldview? And in the last two episodes, we looked at the first ideology in the series, which was realism. It's not completely necessary that you watch that podcast in order to get something from this one, but if the word realism in an ideological sense is something foreign to you, then I strongly recommend watching it. Because, like I said in the previous episode, realism and liberalism are more or less antonyms of each other. Remember, when you hear a bell, that is to notify you that I'm using some advanced vocabulary or maybe introducing a concept that you haven't heard before. If you're just listening to this podcast, don't worry, because at the end of the episode, I'm going to give you an oral and written account of these new vocabulary. The word liberal is ubiquitous these days. You see it everywhere, in newspapers, on social media, to describe somebody who cares for the environment. Or perhaps liberal could mean somebody who believes in human rights. But liberal can also be used nowadays to describe somebody who is against free speech, which sounds quite counterintuitive. For example, Meta, which own both Facebook and Instagram, are often seen as liberal companies, but nevertheless have quite strict rules about what is allowed on their platforms, which seems a little antithetical to the core principles of liberalism, like free speech and individual rights. We'll talk more about this later. In the first two episodes, talking about realism, we followed a quite simple pattern, I hope, which was first to outline some axioms of realism, some things which realists say are true about the world, or maybe the international structure. We also took a look at the two most prominent types of realism, which are classical realism and structural realism. And then I gave you a real-life example to see if maybe you're more of a classical realist or a structural realist. Today and the next episode, we're going to follow a similar pattern, but this time with liberalism. So what is liberalism exactly? What does it mean to be a liberal? Broadly speaking, liberalism is a political and ideological worldview that gained some traction in the 17th and 18th centuries as countries like France and the US opposed absolute or monarchistic rule. Sorry, talking a bit too much about history there. Actually, the purpose of this podcast is not to give you a history lesson. I'm sure there's other better, more qualified people who can tell you the history of these things step by step. I want to talk about the fundamental aspects, the existential idea. In this episode, we're going to talk about 4 axioms of liberalism. In realism, we talked about 2, but actually in liberalism, there's many, maybe 8 or 10, and actually not all liberals agree on some of them. So I'm going to introduce to you the 4 which I think are the most fundamental, and also because often they are at odds with some of the other axioms in other ideologies. So that's the plan for this episode, which will be the first part of liberalism. The first and perhaps the most important axiom of liberalism is that cooperation is a win-win. So instead of being a deal or a trade agreement where one party gets a good deal and the other one inevitably gets a bad deal, in liberalism, they believe that it's possible to have a deal where everybody wins. So fundamentally, for liberals, cooperation is a win-win. So we should try to cooperate with each other and perhaps, in some cases, trust each other and trust that they have goodwill towards us, that not only do they want to thrive and succeed as a country, but perhaps you, as their neighbor, they would also like to thrive. For realists, they probably would disagree with this idea that one nation cares about their neighbor thriving or not, but rather maybe they would like to see them do well so that they don't have any problems with them. But for liberals, cooperating with each other, either on an individual level or a national level, depending on what kind of liberalism, is beneficial for both parties. At least it's possible to have a win-win situation. For realists, almost any trade or deal has a winner and a loser. So that's a key difference between liberalism and realism. What do you think about that? Do you think that in every deal there's a winner and a loser, or is it possible that everybody can win? Please comment. The second axiom of liberalism is that democracies don't fight. Since World War II, for example, and the inception of, let's say, the European Union, the EU, there hasn't been a war, at least not within EU countries. In fact, liberalism and democracy can often go hand in hand, because if the core idea is that we should cooperate with each other, then of course we would prioritize a system where every individual has a say. And of course, a democracy is a society where, at least in theory, every citizen has a vote, has a say in how the country is run. Maybe, so nowadays the way that elections work, and, we cannot always trust if there is any corruption or not, and things like that. Not every democracy is perfect. Nevertheless, the idea and the core principle of a democracy is that everyone has a say. So, of course, democracy and cooperation are highly linked. And, for example, institutions like the UN existing and being popular and more countries becoming democratic is no mistake. Because, as a matter of fact, international organizations like the United Nations and so on, since their inception, have supported the idea of globalization and cooperating in order to have win-win situations. Nowadays, almost every country is a member of the UN. For liberals, these organizations like the UN are a success and show that liberalism is the way that the world is, and that we should reap the benefits of this system. The point that we don't always have to fight with each other, whether it's on an individual level, like fighting for a job, perhaps, or on a national level, like going to war. For liberals, everybody can win if we just work together. So this second axiom, democracies don't fight. Maybe you're thinking, can this be true? The idea here, according to liberals, is that since World War II, for example, and the inception of, let's say, the European Union, the EU, there hasn't been a war, at least not within EU countries since then. Of course, now there's a war in Ukraine, but technically it's not in the EU. So this is the point that, being in the EU being a liberal institution has helped, or there's been some factor here that has made it so that there's no war in the EU. But of course, there's some drawbacks to this theory. Like I said, with Ukraine, although they're not in the EU, they are a democracy officially. And actually, Russia are also a democracy officially. But what does it really mean to be a democracy? We're not going to go into great detail about that. But my point is that if a country says it's a democracy, is it really a democracy? Well, this idea that democracies don't fight, maybe it works for countries that are truly democratic, not just say that they're democratic, but they have a high score on the democracy index, which you can take a look at if you like. But for example, I'm not picking on Russia or something here. Even the US, according to this index, are much below many other countries in terms of the democracy index. So, for example, this idea that your vote counts, or that everybody has equal rights or the equal ability to be successful, this is something we can talk about as a goal of democracy. But even in the US or the UK, it's not as good as some other countries. Some realists, for example, might say that the UN is not truly democratic, or that even though many countries are a part of the UN, some countries can avoid doing what they're told or what they're advised to do by the UN. We talked about this in an episode previous, where I mentioned Donald Trump and the USA withdrawing from the Paris Accord. So this is an example of the UN or certain agreements, although they can involve the world and try to be democratic and to be liberal, they're not a world government after all, right? So for liberals, the UN and such international organizations makes the world a better place because we can cooperate easier and more efficiently, and we can even have shared goals and things like that. But for a realist, for example, the UN, although it might help with some things, at the end of the day, if a powerful country doesn't want to follow the advice of the UN, then usually they cannot stop them. So what do you think? Do you think the UN and other institutions like this are more good than bad? Do they create more opportunities than threats? Let me know in the comments. This idea that democracies don't fight is actually an idea that came from Francis Fukuyama, who created the theory, the democratic peace theory. And here he supposes that, like I said, democratic nations don't go to war with each other for many reasons, such as being members of the same groups and unions, such as EU members in Europe, but also for other reasons. And that takes us to the third axiom, which is trade beats war. So both of these axioms are actually about conflict, about the avoidance of war, meaning that, let's say they believe the world is a place where cooperation is mutually beneficial, right? We can say that's one axiom. So if they believe this, then they think that acting in this way, which is cooperating and helping each other, will create democracies and will help trade, and having a democracy and having trade together will stop a war happening. Okay. And in the case of this third axiom, that trade beats war, we can also look at the EU as an example. Last 80 years or so, international trade has skyrocketed. We're truly in an era of globalization nowadays, at least within the developed world. So for liberals, as well as EU members being democratic, all of these countries in the EU are economically interdependent. The fact that we live in such a globalized world and we have so many imports and exports to many different countries, making us economically interdependent, this makes it so that we are against war, at least for the most part, because if you end up having a conflict with a neighboring country or even a country from the other side of the world, which you rely on for some typical food type or maybe some electronics, then this can have a huge impact on your nation. So the first three axioms of liberalism are that cooperation is a win-win situation, democracies don't fight, and trade beats war. The last axiom of liberalism that we're going to discuss today is the topic of soft power. So an axiom for liberals, we could say, is that soft power can triumph over hard power. So if you watched the previous episodes, you will know that realists believe in hard power. And hard power is something that is material and undeniable. So on a national level, we can say that a nation is powerful, according to realists, if they have a large population and a lot of wealth, a lot of money, because in this case, they can have a strong and developed army. But liberals introduce this part of soft power. So what is soft power? Well, according to Nye, soft power is the ability to influence others and shape preferences through attraction and persuasion. rather than through coercion or force. It's a form of power that relies on a nation's appeal. So like we said, hard power is something that is measurable and undeniable, like a strong army. Soft power can be things that are intangible and maybe a bit more subjective. This can include the culture, the history, the reputation in the international environment. For example, Sweden, although it's a relatively small country, has a long history and a good reputation all over the world as a country which is democratic and relatively peaceful and so on. So if somebody tried to attack Sweden, even if they had a bigger army, Sweden's soft power, having a lot of allies, for example, might give it the upper hand in this conflict. So for great powers, although they're usually defined by hard power, like in Russia's case, many people would call them a great power because they have many nuclear weapons, and this is an undeniable hard power asset, right? But the US, of course, also have many nuclear weapons, so cannot deny that they're powerful from a hard power perspective as well. But American culture has revolutionized the 20th and even the 21st century. The American dream, American movies, Hollywood, many companies, like especially their leaders, like Elon Musk and Bill Gates, these are people that are known around the world, right? And this is an example of soft power. While China was not known to be a country which invested much in foreign direct investment, maybe 20, 30, or 40 years ago, in the last 10 years, China has been investing billions of dollars in places all over Africa, for example. So whatever the US might think of China, for many African countries right now, they love China because China is willing to give them money, which they can use to build things in their towns, in their villages around the country. And this is an example of soft power. The point here about hard power and soft power is that they're two different types of power. And usually, at least on an international level, these two powers work together. Maybe we could say it's a bit like yin-yang. That concludes this episode of the podcast, which was Liberalism Part 1. In Part 2, we're going to look at the two most prominent types of liberalism, which are classical liberalism and neoliberalism. In this episode, we looked at 4 axioms of liberalism, which all, or at least most, liberals share. They were that cooperation is a win-win, democracies don't fight, trade beats war, and finally, that soft power can triumph over hard power. Now let's finish with a quote from Joseph Nye. As we think of power in the 21st century, we want to get away from this idea that power is always zero-sum. My gain is your loss and vice versa. Power can also be positive-sum, where your gain can be my gain. Last but not least, here's today's key vocabulary, page 1. Antonym, a word with the opposite meaning of another word, the opposite of a synonym. Ubiquitous, existing or being everywhere, or in all places at the same time, omnipresent. Counterintuitive, something that doesn't work or happen as common sense would suggest. Logical. Antithetical, exactly the opposite, contradictory. To gain traction, to start becoming popular, trendy, and or successful. To be at odds, to disagree. Goodwill, a friendly attitude in which you wish that good things happen to people. Inception, the beginning of something, origin. To go hand in hand, to be strongly related, highly linked. To skyrocket, to increase suddenly and extremely. Economic interdependence, the idea that many developed nations rely on other nations for things like food and electronics in order for their countries to keep running. Finally, to give the upper hand, to have more power than another agent and therefore have